So welcome. We have two guests today. First is US born and Mexican bred Carl J. Kravitz, a multifaceted entrepreneur with over 30 years of experience in the US Hispanic market. He is co-chair and CEO of Vida y Salud Media Group, Inc., publisher of the Spanish language health website vidaysalud.com. He was board chairman of Los Angeles-based Hispanic advertising agency Cruz Cravit Ideas, which he founded in 1991. He's also past chairman of the Association of Hispanic Advertising Agencies, AHA, and past chair of the Hispanic Advertising Agencies Foundation. He's also a past member of the board of American Association of Advertising Agencies, the 4As, and co-chaired its Hispanic committee and served on the Government Relations Committee. And in that capacity, he authored the 4A's A Client's Guide to Hispanic Marketing, and is still in great demand as a speaker on multicultural marketing issues. We also have with us Michelle Cordova, who is the founding director of Vision Strategy and Insights, VSI, a multicultural research and strategy firm specializing in generating actionable insights into the Hispanic, African American, Asian consumer segments. VSI is unique in providing research and consulting services not only to consumer-facing industries such as healthcare, CPG, financial services, and retail, but also to political, social cause, and nonprofit organizations. Before establishing VSI, Michelle managed her own multicultural marketing and consulting firm. Her background is in the television industry, having led the marketing and promotions departments at both Univision and Telemundo. And in her capacity as a special events producer with Univision, Ms. Cordova led several Emmy Award-winning local and national television productions. So we're here to talk about a subject and a word that is not part of the current vernacular, which is the concept of the Viejennial. So Adweek recently published an article, and this is why this comes to bear, recently published an article asking why targeting millennial consumers might not be such a hot idea after all. And the subhead of that article is that a growing body of evidence shows why Gen Y consumers are not ideal, essentially because many of them are broke. Right? So along those lines, and in that same article, a blogger, Mike Shedlock, refers to the millennial age cohort as the screwed generation. And I want to talk about the Viejennials potentially as the shrewd generation. And let's talk about what the difference is between those from a Hispanic marketing perspective.
Before we start on that though, can we sort of define millennial and Viejennial in demo terms?
Sure. I think most people would agree that millennials were born in the late 80s, early 90s, and are up to the mid 30s today.
Okay.
And then everybody older than that is
qualifies as a Viejennial?
would be baby boomer in the general market,
Yeah,
but what would
right.
be the equivalent in Spanish? So we're going to coin the term for the moment, Viejennial, to sort of describe differences between the two and why ignore Viejennials, which seems to be the trend in Latin advertising, seems to be very focused, with few exceptions, seems to be very focused on the millennial because they're digital natives, because they're multi-channel, because of all the reasons, all the sort of buzz terms of marketing these days.
Is it just sexier?
Yeah.
Well, and I would say also, just in our world, in research, we define millennials, we split millennials actually into 3 different groups, just as Latinos overall aren't just one group of people. We define millennials as the ones that are still living at home, the ones that are living outside of home but don't have children, and then the ones that are having their own households and have children, which act more like their Viejennial parents than they do the younger cohort.
So one thing that's interesting is that Viejennials, they have a disposable income that's estimated at about $1.4 or $1.5 trillion. And I focus on that number because the Hispanic market in general has a buying power that is probably in the 2 trillion range. But somehow the millennial demographic gets a lot more advertising investment than the Hispanic market overall. Now, 25, at least I think 25% of the millennial audience today is Hispanic,
At
right?
least.
So, and that's trending up. The next generation, the Gen Z generation, is going to be
Right.
25
Yeah,
plus.
significant.
But what about the rest of the Latino, the other 75% of the Latino market? How is it? Let's start with how is it different from the millennials?
Okay. Again, it's interesting because we're at a time in the history of United States marketing where overall trends are towards becoming much more specific. And we're still talking about the Hispanic market as though it had two components, which is absolute nonsense. It has,
Much richer.
25 million components if you're really individualizing advertising.
I was going to actually ask that. Is it too simplistic to break it down into two markets?
It's way too simplistic, and for the last 20 years, I think, in terms of Hispanic marketing at least, the market has been trending towards simplistic solutions, simplistic answers, and simplistic solutions. It started in the day when everyone talked about nothing but efficiency, and the whole notion of effectiveness kind of went out the window. And everything was about how efficient can I make my buy, which has led to basically to the death of many Hispanic-focused advertising agencies, marketing agencies.
The independents, for
of
sure.
different types. Most of the independents are gone at this point, because the idea took root that you could reach a total marketplace using one single agency who could hire a couple of Latinos and basically adapt or consult with, if their consulting advice was accepted, the general market creative groups. But what it led to was precisely this. You now had young Latino millennials speaking with their Anglo-millennial cohorts at general market agencies, and they created this notion of the Latino millennial, which is way too large a segment to be able to speak to in itself. It's way too large a segment to be able to speak to in one single way. But what it did was it kind of abandoned everyone from the ages of 35 plus, which included a significant component of immigrants who grew up in speaking Spanish at home and who were educated in Spanish in their countries of origin, and who may speak English very well, but for whom the language of emotion continues to be Spanish. My home is a perfect example of that. You listen to me and you'd never guess, but Spanish is what we speak at home. And it is the language of emotion for us, as opposed to the language of logic and fact. So it basically abandoned everyone above the age of 35 plus who have some very, very significant personal and cultural differences, even from their own kids who may have been born in the US and who might be part of the 35 and under generation.
And I think beyond that, the Hispanic millennial can be starkly different from the general market millennial. You said you had three groups: the millennial who lives at home, the millennial who lives outside of home but no kids, and the millennial with kids, right?
Right.
More adults.
Their own household, yeah.
However, in the Hispanic culture, we have a lot of people who live at home, who choose to live at home,
Correct.
and may not fit into that little category of, they're millennials because they live at home. Their millennial may be an age, but their shopping habits, their consumption habits may be very, very different from that fact. So I agree with you. The labels sometimes obfuscate too much and hide too many differences that will make us better marketers.
We have a tendency as humans to try to want to group people into tribes,
Right.
in one way or another, and it's way too simplistic. Or the tribes that we're trying to group people into are too large. And this not only has to do with Latinos. It has to. That's another issue.
That Latinx,
Who calls
yes.
themselves Latinos? Who calls themselves Chicanos? Who calls themselves Hispanics? That all by itself should indicate that people look at themselves in different ways and are motivated by different.
Yeah,
by
but
different
it also
things.
goes in language. For example, I call myself Hispanic when I'm speaking English. When I'm speaking Spanish, I'm Latina.
Right.
because the word
And
it's
young
perfectly-
young people like to identify themselves as Latinx,
Yes.
right? Which works sometimes when you're writing, but a little bit harder when you're speaking.
When you're speaking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I
Especially
think
speaking in Spanish.
right.
It's almost
Latinx.
impossible to
I
pronounce.
think
Latino?
I think part of exactly. I think part of the issue comes with this kind of the overriding feeling that the understanding people had of immigration that's so different today, right? So you see that the growth in Latino population is coming from U.S. born, not from immigration anymore, and that's a social phenomenon and that's a real thing.
Regardless of what the administration wants to say.
Exactly. But I think it's important that we realize that there are still a huge group of, as Carl mentioned, this is a huge group of immigrants that are living in, founding households and being the primary social influencer of their millennial children. So that's part of it. The other part is that the traditional assimilation path was a straight linear path from point A to point B. Right, we have so many Latinos in the country now, and other groups of people that it's pushing back. Point B is pushing back, and it's altering, right, what to be an American is. So when you think about the continuum of people and what languages they're using and what as you said, the language of emotion, you can't just assume, well, they're U.S. born and so therefore they're American, and we don't need to treat them as Latinos in a marketing sense, because for a lot of products and services you do.
Mm-hmm. And to me, it's an enormous misconception, because that assumes that there is a definition of what is an American.
Correct.
And Americans come in many different shades and colors and textures, and if you grew up in Iowa in a farming family, and going to town meant going to a place that had 2,000 or 3,000 inhabitants, all of whom looked like you and worshipped in the same church and went to the same high school, you're going to be quite different than someone who grew up in New York City, hearing many different languages on the street and seeing people of different colors and people who did who lived very different lives than they did, to someone who grew up in Texas, who probably in a lot of ways, you want to offend a Texan, ask them if they're a Texan first or an American first. Right? But guess what, they are both, and it's very similar to the way many Latinos are both.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe different at home, and maybe different at a time when you're trying to reach them, to persuade them to engage in a behavior or to purchase a product or service, than they are at work, or than they are in the street, or than they are, when they're together with their kids of other generations.
Yeah.
The answer to this may be obvious, but in another session we were talking about language and how Spanish is evolving in the United States. What do we think are the biggest differences between the Millennials, whether it's one bucket or three, and the Viejennials, whether it's one bucket or 25? There's some from a marketing perspective, there's some very actionable differences in the media that we choose to reach them with. They're creatively, content-wise, there are differences. But are there more differences than there are similarities? In reaching Millennials, are we abandoning Viejennials and vice versa?
In a sense, as my perception in looking at the marketplace today and looking at the way people are speaking to the different generations, is that in speaking to millennial Latinos, we're speaking in a lot of ways to their abandonment of many of the things that were very specific to their parents, and to their blending more into a kind of a multicultural group of individuals. And they've gone to grade school and middle school and high school with people of different races and different languages, and coming from different places and different religions, and maybe are not quite as set in the world in which their parents might have grown up in. So to me, when I look at Viejennials, so to speak, I think about language. I think about that they're more likely to have had at least part of their education in Spanish. They're more likely to have spoken to their own parents and earlier generations in Spanish. They're more likely to be more religious, whether that religion is Catholicism primarily, but also more and more evangelical. They are more likely to see gender roles in a much more specific and differentiated state. Those three things I think are pretty specific. But there are places where the generations cross, and also it become by default they're easy to fall back into when you're advertising, sports, music,
Exactly.
food.
Yeah.
And that's what I was going to say. In the digital, when you most people choose digital to approach millennials, and in the digital world, so much of it is entertainment based, and so much of that for Latino millennials is in Spanish. They're following the music and the artists and the sports programming that they're still living that in Spanish. So there's a lot of opportunities to still reach people in a very relevant way, millennial Latinos, in Spanish.
Well, and the interesting thing is, particularly when you look at music, is that millennials have been bringing African American elements
Absolutely.
back into Latino music, and we start to see things like Latino rap, reggaeton,
Right.
which really are a blend of different traditions. It's not the music that their parents used to listen to.
Right. And it goes both ways.
Yeah,
Yeah.
reggaeton is tremendously popular in Latin America.
Well,
Yeah.
now with
Yeah.
Despacito, it's crossing.
Yeah, to
In
general
mainstream
market.
America.
Yeah.
But rap, you'll see rap artists also using Latino,
Yeah,
using Latino
absolutely.
artists on their albums as well. So I think it's just it's a matter of what you're. Like I think what we've been talking about a lot is who's your target, what media are they consuming, and how can you best reach them? How are they using your product, and how can you best reach them?
And how specific can you get? Because if you're just thinking that they're just these two large groups of Latinos, you're probably doing a lousy job reaching both of them.
Right.
Because you're being too broad. You're not being specific enough. You're not getting to the messages that take both intellectual and emotional.
Right, but I think what we're talking about is sort of targeting millennials at the cost of targeting other
Right.
groups.
And I think there's two things at play there. Number one is understanding and appreciating the size of that market and the cost of ignoring it, right? The over 35. And it's relatively easy and cost effective to reach them because you reach them through Spanish language media. And the second thing you're ignoring is the strength of those Viejennials as an influencer on millennials. Right, so
Yes.
the products that they choose to use in their household are going to be the products that the millennials take to their new household, still sometimes in the civic engagement or political realms, we reach the influencers almost as much as the voter themselves, right? So even if the Viejennial isn't a citizen or a voter, they're still exercising an incredible amount of influence on the people in their family to get out and vote or to participate in that in civic life. So I don't think we should underestimate the power of Viejennials as influencers.
Yeah, in terms of the content of our lives,
Mhm.
but in terms of the media that we're exposed to, do you think that it operates in reverse? Do we think the millennial generation is helping the Viejennials adapt to new channels? We read all the time about the over-indexing of Facebook, and that's across the entire market. Actually, you're here because of Vida y Salud. Vida y Salud is a digital platform.
It's a digital
right?
platform, right?
What's the average demo of Vida y Salud?
Because it's health. The core consumer for health information tends to be a woman 50 plus.
Absolutely.
Right.
Even when it's about men's sexual issues, it's the
so-
woman doing the research for her husband. So that's the core. In the case of Vida y Salud, we saw a hole in the marketplace because no one was delivering easily comprehensible and actionable health information in Spanish. So our core consumer is a Spanish-speaking woman, 50 plus.
So we found that with we worked on a lot of the ACA, the ACA rollout in states that didn't have their own exchanges. So like not California, but a lot of other states that didn't have their own exchanges. We worked on that, and it was the exact same thing. The target was millennial youth, right? Under people who were going to community colleges, didn't have health insurance through their colleges, but who we targeted with the media and with the navegadoras, the people that helped get you the health insurance coverage, was women 50 plus, because those are the ones making the decisions for these millennial youth. So we didn't do a lot of advertising directly to the millennial youth. We advertised to their moms.
And I think that goes to one of the biggest differentials in the Hispanic market, which is the multi-generational family or household rather. I mean, oftentimes that you have at least three generations, if not more, and maybe extended family living under one roof.
Yeah. And that woman who's in the middle,
right,
is looking at her parents' health, she's
Right.
looking at her kids' health, and she's looking at her own and her husband's health
right.
at the same time. And so it's a fascinating category to be in. It created an enormous problem for us in terms of how do you monetize Vida y Salud? Because now we're looking at a tiny slice of the entire US Hispanic market, and what happens when you go online? Suddenly you're worldwide. Right? So we suddenly found that 85% of our traffic was coming from Latin America and Spain. Right? Because the same gap existed in those countries.
Yeah.
And of course that becomes very challenging because companies are not set up to buy across geographies.
Right. Yes.
Yeah, we've found that we have two clients targeting what we would call the Viejennials, 35 plus, adults, Hispanics, 35 plus. And those two clients combined, we've probably generated last year $87 million in sales, which is a huge, you would think in this age where everybody's targeting the millennial audience, the 35 down, how's that possible? But I would argue that that's where the money is in the Hispanic market. And if we think that the Hispanic millennial, although different from a marketing perspective, is similar to the opening premise of this session, that they're broke or they don't have the disposable income that the older generations do, then it begins to make sense. So when you're looking at the Hispanic market, if you're targeting an older demo, then that's what you've got to do. But to your point, if you want a gatekeeper for the millennial audience, then you're still targeting the Viejennials. You still got to focus on the Hispanic market that we all grew out of. It's still vibrant. It's still the majority.
Absolutely.
And with immigration being the way it is, even though it's younger, the immigration is younger from an age perspective, probably from a social value perspective, looks more like the Viejennial audience.
Absolutely.
Well, Latino millennials are suffering the same issues that general market millennials are suffering. They're living at home with the parents. Their jobs are paying less than the same jobs used to pay their parents a generation ago, and life is tough. Life is tough.
But you could also argue that the same way that 20 years ago or 20 plus years ago when we all started in this business, and people told us that Latinos weren't going to buy BMWs and they weren't going to buy, they would buy Pepsi and Pampers, but that's about it, right? We have to make an investment in millennials as well in terms of brand preference, right? And knowing what else is out there and giving them those aspirational campaigns as well.
Well, you have to look at the people who will have the money in the future and the people who do have the money in the present. And if you're only doing one of those two things, you're missing a massive opportunity to generate sales.
Yeah, to that point, Claritas came out with a report about a month ago where they estimated across several categories that the average lifetime value to any company is, I don't know how many thousands of dollars more for Latinos than it is for the general market.
Yeah.
Right, it was
Because
based
it's
on lifespan and the age that they are right now.
Current age and,
Yes.
which
Because
is
we're a younger
interesting.
audience.
Yeah.
It's interesting, and it dovetails directly into our experience with our clients. Our two major clients, the lifetime value of their Hispanic consumer is much greater than a non-Hispanic consumer. So,
It makes sense if you depart from the age, their age today.
Right, and the difference in between direct-to-consumer marketing and brand marketing is that the direct-to-consumer marketing executive leaves his or her prejudice at the door because he goes with the sales. So if the sales are being generated by Hispanics, that's where the budget is going. Whereas in the brand world, the prejudice and kind of the racial animus is still very prevalent because budgets are not dictated by consumers, but by consumer consumption. Budgets are directed by marketing professionals who may or may not have really the pulse of their consumers.
Well, this is one place where you would have hoped that analytics would have made an enormous difference. I think the companies that have analytics at their core, and I'm talking about companies like Procter & Gamble,
And Johnson & Johnson.
Johnson & Johnson. I mean, these are companies that were analytics
Well, and
before
for us-
the word analytics existed.
For us as a direct response agency, it's all about
It's all about-
analytics. It
yeah.
tracks everything.
Yeah, so you would have hoped that analytics would have taken racial animus out of the equation, and they may ultimately.
Okay, racial animus
They may,
is
but-
racial animus is a strong word, and I want to come back to something you said earlier. In our space today in Hispanic marketing, people talk about the total market.
Mhm.
You mentioned general market agencies have gobbled up independents. Latino millennials and their cohorts have sort of co-opted Hispanic marketing. So in some ways, does focusing on the Hispanic millennial give permission to advertisers to be total marketers so they don't have to deal with Viejennials? Is that what's happening?
It is what's happening, and it's not what should be happening for a simple reason. If you embrace the concept of total market, which I do not, and I'll come back to that in a moment. What you're essentially saying is that as the young Latinos enter the general market, you should be covering them with your general market budget.
Mm-hmm.
Why should you be taking money away from your Hispanic budget, which was already too small and which was originally designed to speak to people in Spanish? It doesn't make sense that you would be taking from what was already too small instead of recognizing that you're trying to talk to people as they become part of a larger group. I think there's some fallacies, and I think it's being used as an excuse to eliminate Hispanic budgets, but using fallacious reasoning.
Mm-hmm.
To me, the notion of total market anyway is essentially means that you're doing a half-assed job reaching everyone. Because you're not doing anything that's specific enough and focused enough and persuasive enough to any single segment. You're trying to talk to everybody the same way. And if you look, and I don't want to dive deeply into politics in the United States right now, but I do want to say that it's very clear that you can't talk to everybody the same way. Different things motivate different people, and I think that the political divide is just one really good example of that. There isn't a single message which resonates with everybody.
Mm-hmm.
So the notion of
you
total
probably
market
couldn't
is
do a total
a
market
fallacy.
political campaign.
Yeah.
Not at all.
It'd
No.
almost be impossible.
But for a market, is it feasible to really parse out your message to target individual
Well,
groups?
it's the direction. It's the promise of digital.
It's a promise of digital,
And,
yeah, but
and it's not only the promise of digital, it's the trend not only in communications, it's the trend in manufacturing today. We're talking about mass customization. We're talking about, we're looking at ways to make things more individual, more special, more responsive to your particular needs or your particular needs, different as they may be. It's the societal trend in general. And I think that in some ways, oddly enough, the communications part of it lags behind, which is interesting because communications and advertising and everything else tended to be leaders, and I think they've kind of sagged behind where technologists are talking and futurists are talking and and artificial intelligence proponents are talking. We're looking at a world that's becoming more individualized, and we're trying to make our communications less individualized.
Yeah. I think a good
Doesn't make
example.
sense.
I think a good example of that is Pandora, right? Pandora, if you listen to Spanish music, they will serve you ads in Spanish. They're not worried about whether you're Hispanic or not. If you're listening to Spanish music, they're going to serve you ads in Spanish, right? They're going to make some assumptions about you based on your choices. And I think that's what digital is trying to do. So there isn't anybody in the back worrying about kind of who they're serving. They're serving what the content is driving.
One of the really big issues to me, and I think it's a problem in the way it was necessary, and yet it's problematic in the way that our industry was born. And that is that one particular company, Univision, which started out as Spanish International Network, sold the notion of the Spanish language as the strategic way to reach Hispanics, as your Hispanic strategy was Spanish. I think what we've learned over the years is that Spanish is not a strategy, it's a tactic.
Mm-hmm.
And that you've got to get your strategy right first, and then worry about age, language,
And does that strategy start
generation.
with culture, with the definition of culture,
I-
maybe? Or is
well-
culture tactical too?
No, I think culture is more strategic, but again, it depends on what your definition of culture is.
Well, let's say Hispanic culture in some broad term, or Latin culture.
is closer to being a strategy, but your strategy really is about what is your overall system. It's a system as opposed to being one specific piece of the puzzle. What is the system you are going to use to persuade people to behave in the way you want them to behave? And what are all of the different little pieces that go into that system? And those, in a way, are the definition of culture. If we go back to the notion of tribes, and I don't mean tribes in terms of Aboriginal populations, I mean tribes in terms of the way people choose to group themselves. And it's a personal choice. It's not it being imposed from the outside. It's who do you choose to be your tribe? All of those things, the culture of that tribe is made up of many, 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 many different things, ranging from behaviors, preferences, choices. And we're not really good at that. We've had a tendency over the years to think of Latinos or Hispanics as a tribe, and recently to start dividing it into two tribes at the expense of the larger picture. I think we've been overly simplistic in a world which has become more and more complex.
So
We're fighting the tide.
So we end where we started.
We do.
So we can talk a lot more about this, but time's run out. You want to add something?
No, it's just, I'm lost as to where we ended.
That it's too simplistic.
Embrace complexity.
I agree.
Mhm.
Yeah, and one group is not replacing another group. That growth is not. I think people tend to look at it as, well, millennials are getting larger, and this, I mean, you don't do that in the general market. You don't stop talking to 55 plus because they're 55, right?
If not, watch the news on a daily basis. It's only 55 plus.
And there is one industry I'd like to call out, and that is the pharmaceutical industry. And I've spent my last 10 years in health, but it's very interesting. If your core consumer is a woman 50 plus and she's making health decisions for her family, why aren't you doing it in Spanish? Why are you spending billions and billions and billions of dollars filling prime time broadcast television and cable with ads about plaque psoriasis and doing absolutely zero in Spanish? Somebody is not doing their job.
Or doesn't want to.
Or doesn't want to.
But that's always been the issue in Spanish marketing. That the most natural advertisers are not flocking to the market as they should.
And look at your analytics. I think you'll probably find you're making
I
a
used
grave
a word that you
mistake.
thought was too strong, but I think that motivates everything. It's the same reason why a CPM in Spanish is not worth the same amount as a CPM in English, and it's at the core of.
And a dollar is a
everything.
dollar is
A
a
dollar
dollar.
is a dollar.
Yeah,
Right, until you're
dollar is not a peso.
asking to take some dollars from another company, and then there's a lot of reasons why that shouldn't happen.
yeah.
Well, thank you to anybody who's watching or listening. We welcome you to challenge us, agree with us, differ with us, write to us. We're going to put up everybody's emails up on the screen at the end of this feedcast. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.